Hey, it's Tabuli again, recording for the Map Room, where my friend Tristan and I talk about Atlas Altera, a creative project about repainting the world. In today's episode, we give a cursory and broad overview of cultural contact and spread in Altera. It's a lengthy one, but I just couldn't bear to break it apart into segments. If you don't make it through the whole thing, that's on us. Just don't forget to like and subscribe.
Today we're going to talk about one of your top diagrams in the Chorographical Depictions map, right?
Yep.
Which is the Sources of Nation diagram.
Right.
Confluences of Human Culture.
Yes.
You call it.
Yeah.
I like it. It looks really cool. It looks both as a root network, a branch network, but also a river network.
Yeah.
It's I really like the artistic creativity you got there.
Thank you.
So what are we looking at?
What we're looking at is something that can somewhat be a map and somewhat be a timeline. It can function as a map and it can function as a timeline. So in a map sense, we're looking at different areas around the world where domestication of crops happen. That's the literal understanding, okay? Domestication of crops is the literal basis of this map, but it's a talking point for many other things of human history. Mm-hmm. The time part, the temporal part, is following the river lines, and you can see as the river lines get bigger, that's just like it's showing that it's gathering things as this goes along the way. So it's gathering culture, gathering technology, gathering ideas, and then those river things meet at confluences, and then get even bigger, which kind of is like a metaphor for globalization. This whole river network, as it's going down river, is kind of like progressing through time. So the small river source is like the beginning of time, and the delta in the bottom is like the end, or where we are in contemporary times. Now, it's also kind of flawed in the sense that there is no real, like that is an arbitrary beginning. Domestication events in human history are not the beginning of human history.
Right. So let's dive into one of the examples.
Okay.
Let's start in the top right. So you have the Ko and the Kyong,
Right.
which merge, and then they merge into the Tigris and Euphrates. So we know those words as being the rivers in Mesopotamia.
Right.
So you have these lines which start as rivers, but are also analogies for areas of crop domestication.
Good catch there. What I meant to say was that these crop domestications that are represented kind of spatially around here, the kind of textbook answer is that crops were domesticated by sedentary populations, by people around river valleys. And the most clear textbook example of this is when desertification happens and people are driven to a river basin, so the Nile and the Mesopotamian rivers, and then that leads to them experimenting with the vegetation around them to have consistent yield of food, so they don't have to venture out.
Okay, so let's look at those examples concretely. So let's start at the top right.
Okay.
So we have these different rivers, right?
Yeah.
Which represent different areas. So Euphrates and Tigris represent the Middle East, Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
Ho and Kyong represent China.
Yeah.
And the Niger and the Adbara represent Africa.
Yeah, sub-Saharan Africa.
Sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
Okay. So could you tell us a little more about these different streams?
Yeah, sure.
And what crops are associated to each river?
Okay, yeah. So, we know that a lot of like the wheat varieties, wheat species, wheat-like species, of wheat and corn, barley, and rye, oat. So, oats, funny enough, oats got in by themselves. They actually started being they accidentally grew in the conditions that humans were doing to grow wheat. So they domesticated themselves. They got into our fields.
Okay, we're going.
Okay, anyways,
too much in detail.
Okay, sorry, but the point is those crops, the crops that we associate with European cuisine, but also Middle Eastern cuisine, were domesticated in Mesopotamia. Now, the reason why the Nile and the Indus rivers are not included in there is because it's posited that the crop package from Mesopotamia reached the Nile and the Indus. It was introduced. That's why not all rivers that are associated with like so-called cradles of civilization are represented here. Whereas rivers where we don't associate with certain cradles of civilization are privileged here. For example, the Atbara and the Niger, these two rivers are branches. The Niger isn't a branch, but the Atbara is a branch of the Nile. and it's beyond the Sud, the big wetlands in South Sudan. So this river is beyond the Sahara in the kind of Sahel area, and this is where sorghum was domesticated. It's posited that sorghum was domesticated here or in the Niger, but both of them are considered separate domestication areas because, like for example, African rice, which is a total different species, varieties of millet, different species of millet, because remember, millet's just a catch-all phrase for things we don't privilege in a kind of high-class taste sense. They are associated with these two different areas in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the Ho and Kyung refer to the fact that we're not so sure that one crop package was brought over to the other. We think that maybe historically the Yangtze River area was a hyper-diverse area for what are called the 100 Yue tribes, 100 Viets. So Vietnam is associated with that name, but Hmong, Thai, Austroasiatic, so Khmer, all these languages actually used to exist around the Yangtze area, including Austronesian, which existed in the Delta. So we believe that in the Sichuan Basin to the Yangtze Delta, there were people domesticating different kinds of grains, while the Chinese were domesticating different millets and eventually also supposedly rice in the Yellow River. But rice might have been domesticated in Southeast Asia as well. We're not really sure. But yeah, these are different events, and they are supposed to be independent of each other. And then as we go downriver, they converge, and then that means that the crops are now being used interchangeably. Like people in East Asia are using barley. The Tibetans, for example, their staple crop is barley, but it's probably domesticated in Mesopotamia. So that's what's the base literal meaning here. But this is also a metaphor for cultural exchange in general. It's like a metaphor for globalization in general.
Mm-hmm. So why is the Niger and the Atbara River so far downstream from the Mesopotamian and East Asian streams?
So the point here is that, like I said earlier, the rivers kind of represent time progress. So a lot of the sub-Saharan African crops didn't reach the Mediterranean and Eurasian world until, a couple centuries after, or maybe even millennia after they were domesticated. So that's why those two, even though they're connected, Afro-Eurasia is one continent, seem to be a bit disconnected from the earlier domestication events.
Okay, and then you have another stream which converges into that big river, which is the Cook and the Dali branches.
Right. So we're looking at the solid black line of the Cook and Dali branches. We'll talk about the dotted lines later, right? But the solid black line of the Cook and Dali is very cool. So this is something that is now accepted, but used to be overlooked, which is that in Papua, you have a major site of domestication. We believe that sugarcane, possibly bananas, and possibly taro were domesticated there. Taro maybe was semi-domesticated, and then more varieties and more domesticated varieties came out through Austronesian contact. But anyway, so there's this little swamp in the highlands called the Cook Swamp that has evidence of taro and all kinds of these different starches, as well as winged bean. It's supposed the winged bean, which is like a super crop, the tuber, the grain, the leaves, they are all edible and highly nutritious. But these things all came from Papua, which are associated as kind of like headhunting hunter-gatherer peoples. But they've probably been farmers longer than most people around the world. Anyway, so that is one domestication event that's real. The Dali is fake in that I found a river called the Dalia River in Northern Territory, Australia, that could actually also be transliterated as a Sanskrit word. So I invented a Sanskrit etymology to the Daly or Dali River, which is named after a European person, D-A-L-Y, but I have a D-A-L-I here. And so it's signaling that, first of all, Indian contact happened here. So they transcribed this river, but it's also suggesting that this domestication event came outside of the Indian contact, so before Indian contact. The Dalia River is interesting here in that it's in the monsoon zone of Australia, which is perfect for kind of like wetland cultivation. And also, this is in the periphery of where Australian rice was semi-domesticated. A third species of rice was domesticated in the world, and it was in Australia. And elders in certain Aboriginal groups in Northern Australia are now trying to pass down how they were able to cultivate and also winnow the rice. And this rice is actually the closest relative to East Asian rice. Anyway, so there's actually tons of crops in Australia unrelated to rice, spinifex, other kinds of grains, mulga, that can yield really good, nutritious starch and protein, like legume equivalent foods, but have been overlooked by Europeans. Europeans always say macadamia nut was the only thing that was domesticated out of Australia, and it was domesticated by Europeans, but it's not true. There's a lot of semi-domesticated foods that Australian Aboriginals still eat today, and it's now making a comeback and called bush tucker food.
Mm-hmm. So what's the approximate timelines for these points of convergence?
So the main point of convergence that is a good kind of anchor point is the Columbian exchange. So you can see where the kind of Americas, what I call the Geminas, their river kind of runs down to the midpoint of this art and meet the Eurasian, Afro-Eurasian one, right?
Okay.
So just one last thing on the Dali and the Cook is that the black line for the Dali and Cook, they represent steady contact with the Indo-Malaysian world. So at some point, the Australian, or what I call Tamirian Aboriginal peoples, and the Papuans will first kind of meet. Around the Torres Strait, they're going to start having a little minor exchange, and then they will be contacted with the Cholas around the 7th to 9th centuries, and that's actually where the dotted line is. So this is, I guess, a good point to just quickly talk about the dotted lines. So dotted lines suggest early contact, but that was sporadic or temporary. So this one was like the Chola missions happened for a while, and then later on, steadier contact happens with the Indo-Malayic world. So, the Sulawesi, Goans, and like Ternate and Tidore in Papua, these are peoples who will regularly do seasonal voyages to Australia, what I call Tamiria, to trade for crops. And then these people would then trade it to India. So that's the steady contact. And it happens before the Europeans arrive, which is why it's above that major confluence point between the two sections of the map.
Right. Okay. So let's look at those streams and rivers on the left side.
Yeah, the other side then. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of those names?
Okay, yeah. Let's start with the top one. The Magdalena River is the artery of Colombia, and it's actually a major river that runs between two branches of the Andes. And so it's posited that certain like mound crop domestications happen. So a lot of tubers were domesticated in the lowland areas. So it's believed that actually a lot of the early domestication events in the Americas, at least, were where people were throwing tubers into earth mounds and then experimenting on their spare time with maize, corn. So they were domesticating cassava and sweet potato before the grain yielding crops and the the quinoa or pseudo cereal crops. Anyway, so that's the Magdalena. And the Magdalena, actually, I almost didn't include because it's part of the Andean crop package. But the river, the branch that really represents the major Andean package that we associate with the Incas and the earlier civilizations in the high Andes, is the Nunchuck River. And the Nunchuck is a very interesting river valley. It runs from the Andes into the Pacific Ocean, and it's a bit north of Cusco and all the places we associate with Incas. It's where the Moche culture comes from, and there are archaeological sites that reveal that peppers and fish and sweet potato were eaten by peoples along this desert coast for millennia. So ceviche, one of the most common dishes and the most popular dishes that you can find in Peru, was eaten without citrus, of course, because citrus comes from the old world, so-called old world. But without citrus, people were eating ceviche for millennia. That's the coolest thing. But anyway, so this river valley is where there's the earliest evidence of crops domesticated that resemble the Andean crops we know today, and would also lead to people in the high Andes, the plateaus, to start experimenting with like more temperate crops. Then you go to the Mescala. The Mescala is a river in Michoacan that runs from the west near the Pacific into the central Mexican plateau. But this is the area where they have the earliest evidence of teosinte, the ancestor to maize or corn. And they have evidence of corn-like teosinte, so like kind of like enlarged teosinte around this area. So this is like the earliest area where corn or maize was domesticated. Maize is the coolest crop because the grain kernels have evolved to be like 10 times, 20 times bigger. Actually, I have no sense of scale, but really big compared to wheat and its native counterpart. Google teosinte and look at it in comparison to corn. Teosinte is a grass. Corn is huge, the kernel. So it's just amazing that people in Mesoamerica were able to do that. Anyway, so that's the Mescala. The Maranun is a play on our world's word Maranao, the Portuguese N, nasal N, and an AO, which is another way of calling the Amazon River. And I believe it comes from a word meaning associated with apple. But I could be mixed up here. But anyway, the Maranun is also a signal, like the spelling and the transliteration. It's a signal that this river was first known to the Islamic world before the Western world, or before it was known to the Europeans. So the Amazon was first explored by Muslim navigators and seafarers. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But the point is actually that I included this as well, because there's very little archaeological evidence left behind by ancient civilizations in the Amazon basin. But now more than ever, we're able to figure out that there were not only hunter-gatherers of really cool cultural adaptations, but what white people traditionally privilege as sedentary civilized peoples. We don't need to use that framework, but my point is that this has got the attention of Europeans, because Europeans are only interested in, it seems that most of them are interested in this kind of stuff because they can see themselves in that. So there are sedentary city building peoples that existed in the Amazon that ironically were first recorded by the Spanish conquistador in the 1500s, but when subsequent voyages went, they couldn't confirm what he saw because a population die-off from disease. So all the cities kind of melted away in the Amazon because the Amazon can reclaim land really quickly. And then the modern day descendants of those peoples still build their towns in the similar way, like an X grid, where there's a central town and then there's like 4 or 5 forest plots around it in a radius. They still build towns the way they used to build cities. So it's just interesting to see that these people still exist, and they always have been, but they've kind of like scaled down. Anyway, so the Amazon is associated with actually 3 pepper species, plus sweet potato and cassava. Maybe not sweet potato, plus cassava. So cassava and peppers were domesticated in the Amazon basin, they believe. And all peppers come from the Andean montane zone, but 3 of them were kind of brought to the Guinean Shield, what I call Venezuela, and like really domesticated there. So it just shows you that there was a lot of cultural things happening in this tropical rainforest area that we're not able to figure out. It's a black box. So that's why I included that river branch. The last one is the Mississippi, which is quite obvious to most people, but actually a lot of Americans still don't know that in like modern day Ohio, there's these huge hills that, if you found out that were built by humans, would equal to the scale of pyramids. So there are these hills that are called mound civilizations or mound cities that existed all along the Mississippi basin, all the way north from the Gulf all the way north to Ohio. And so these peoples actually domesticated their own crops. A lot of them now have been given up because they have some disadvantages. Some of these grains cause seasonal allergies when they're like in bloom, and other grains are just like have lower yield. And so almost everyone in the Mississippi Valley up to the St. Lawrence River basin adopted corn by the time the Europeans came. But their domesticates still exist on the margins of people's fields, and American farmers still spend like thousands, like millions of dollars each year trying to kill off these what they call pest crops. So it's or weeds. It's really interesting because what humans first domesticated is now. Some of these grains are related to like quinoa, like goosefoot, lamb's quarter, pig's feet, duckweed. I don't know, weird names.
Right. So the whole river system to the left represent the crop package from the Americas. Yeah,
and you can see the Mississippi is downriver, but you can see when it joins there, that would be the point where corn or maize makes it. Mm-hmm. So maize made this grand journey, contrary to, we've already talked about guns, germs, and steel, but like contrary to the longitudinal hypothesis of like how hard it is for grains to move longitudinal wise, that was the case for maize actually. It went from a tropical center to like borderline taiga. And today, corn or maize can be grown in like Manchuria, in like northeast China. So it's like one of the most versatile crops.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, so like you said before, that point of convergence is the Columbian exchange.
Yeah, so that major point where the two Black Rivers meet is the Columbian exchange, and that's textbook stuff. Everyone knows that tomatoes and peppers go to the old world. Indians, eat these things and think it's part of their diet. Like kimchi isn't kimchi without chili peppers. Thai curries aren't curries without the red or the green peppers. But these are recent introductions, and you can imagine Sichuanese cuisine using only the Sichuan denumbing berry, the Sichuan pepper, without chili peppers. So it's really interesting. Like the word pepper actually comes from the historic word for black pepper, right? Pipilum. It's a Dravidian word, I think, or Tamil word. So it's already baked into the etymology, but modern humans aren't able to see that etymology, right? So they don't associate this. But yeah, tomatoes, and then cinnamon versus vanilla. Cinnamon goes from the old world to the new world, so that the Mesoamericans actually prefer using cinnamon with chocolate, whereas the Europeans prefer vanilla association with chocolate. Obviously, chocolate itself is a New World thing or a Mesoamerican thing, but it's just an irony that cinnamon from the East Indies goes to the West Indies, vanilla from the West Indies goes to Europe. But anyway.
So what about the two dotted lines before that Columbian exchange?
Okay.
What do they represent?
So the two dotted lines there, it's very interesting. One dotted line is real. The other dotted line is speculative at best and just my fanciful thinking. So the first one, the one that's more old, more ancient, is actually the real one. It's really interesting. We now know, it's now common knowledge, I think, that the Norse made it to Newfoundland, at least Newfoundland, but they might have gone as south as New Jersey. But the Norse went to Newfoundland and they called it Vinland, which I call here Windmark. I create a loose association with the winds, the Slavic winds in the Baltic, because the winds are kind of like the antagonists of Vikings in early Viking lore. But the real etymology is likely that they believe they found grapes, vin, like vino, like wine. Anyway, so that is old news, very simple. My thinking here is that I introduced the Norse and keep that contact sporadic at least, and maybe steady, but in the sense that Europeans for a long time already knew there's this thing called Thule. Thule was either Iceland or beyond Iceland, but they were never interested in it until their fishing stocks collapsed, until cod and all kinds of food sources became scarce. Europeans were not interested in what the Vikings were finding off the coast of the North Atlantic. They knew some speculation, some theories, and Icelandic writings were reaching Rome, but and people the Catholic world knew about their parishes off in Greenland, but always indirectly, through this merchant to this Danish king to this German to then this Italian, that kind of stuff. And so there wasn't too much interest in that, and a lot of it was discounted as hearsay. So this is what's going to happen for me too. For 4 centuries, up until the final days before the Columbian exchange, this Norse contact will be gradual and will be very hard. It will be always on the verge of collapse, because the Greenland colony did collapse. In real life, they weren't able to adapt the way that the Inuit were able to adapt to the changing climate, because they went during a warm period, but then a cold period happened again, and a lot of the crops failed, and they couldn't even do basic kind of stuff, basic kind of sheep herding. But really, in my world, I've extended Greenland's southern tip a little bit more to allow them to survive a little longer. And Newfoundland will be kind of the place where they go seasonally to gather wood and to fish. And eventually, they're going to start settling. But still, the population momentum is so meager at first that there's little momentum. So they can't really, a lot of people would fantasize a Norse domination of Northeast America. I didn't want that. I just wanted them to be able to keep staying there, keep introducing disease, as well as kind of different technological trickling, so iron or maybe even gunpowder at some point. But this is one way for me to build in a channel, a conduit for technological transfer that can allow peoples in Northern America, so Hanunia and Thulia, allow them to survive or have a better chance at enduring colonization 4 centuries later. which leads me to the next dotted line. Is that what you want? Yeah. So the next, which leads me to the next dotted line, which is based off of a very cool speculative theory that the myth of a certain Mansa, so like a sultan, a king, from the Niger, so a Mandinka king, ventured off the coast of West Africa and found the Americas. And it's also, I think the myth is that he never returned. But the point here is that there's actually all the workings in the world, in geography, to allow for this myth to be real. It's just we haven't found evidence yet. And I don't really care. Like, I'm not invested in this kind of whether or not it's true or not. I just think it's a very good potential for my story. Because look at it this way. The ocean currents and the wind patterns, the trade winds that Europeans were relying upon to get them to the Americas, always favored West Africa. So Europeans had to go south, overshooting where they wanted to go in the Americas before they could go to the west to the Americas. They were always sailing south to West Africa and then slingshotting to the Caribbean. And the reason why is because the way the ocean currents work. So, fishermen, just like fishermen in Japan often found themselves off the coast of the Pacific Northwest by accident, fishermen, it's likely if they could survive, their vessels, if they were broken down in the ocean, would venture off into the Caribbean and, Venezuela and the Guianas. Now, the other interesting thing here is that culturally, the West Africans are the most adept in discovering the Americas before Europeans, because their ship hull design was actually the basis of Columbus's ships. The caravels that went and discovered, the caravel is actually an Arabic word of Arabic origin. So what happened is the West African dugout canoes, their hull design was meant for the open ocean. The reason why they designed their ships differently was because just like off the coast of Peru, you have very, very very rich fisheries that are associated with the cold water current. This cold water current makes the Sahara a desert, but it also gives a lot of tantalizing fish. It draws people to the sea. They want to go and fish there because there's no other food in the Sahara. So they rely upon it. So that it gives them the pull factor to want to learn how to sail in the open ocean. Whereas the Europeans off of Portugal, maybe just the Basques. The Basques were always venturing off into the ocean. But most Europeans weren't interested in venturing off in the open ocean. They stuck close to the coastlines, and in the Mediterranean, they learned how to sail in Mediterranean conditions, where the tides were very, the tidal range is small, the winds are a lot more manageable, there's less big, drastic storms. So Mediterranean galleys and the ship technology was not adept to finding the New World. They had to adapt the shipping technology through the Moors. And the Moors, the North Africans, what I call the Atlassians, these people got their ship technologies from dugout canoes of West Africa. So just imagine the West Africans developed bigger boats, just like modern day fishermen off of Senegal. Their canoes are huge. They're really huge, and they're still as ancient traditions. They're still used as their ancient predecessors have, but they're just bigger now. Anyway, so in this, is it called pirogue? Pirogue. Pirogue, yeah. Pirogue is. Did you know that pirogue is actually a Carib word? Really? So it's from the Americas, but it's applied to West African canoes. Huh. Which for me lends itself perfectly for my lore, because there's contact between the Caribbean and West Africa. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so these people trade guilds, kind of like the Chola trade guilds. So it's non-state backed. In my world, fishermen and guilds start finding passage to the Americas, and they start establishing seasonal trade stations. And that means that they bring Islam to this part of the world, and they bring certain food packages, and they also bring back cassava earlier. So West Africa today is very based on cassava, but cassava is a South American crop, tapioca. But anyway, so they get cassava a lot earlier. Anyway, so there's a very kind of mutually beneficial trade contact. But the most important thing is two things: iron and disease. So, Jared Diamond, for his part, is he basically pointed out the obvious, technological gap and disease, right? That's obvious. So in here, I'm trying to narrow those two gaps in my own way. One is iron culture is very interesting. There are different traditions of iron making around the world that sprung up. The Bantus have one of the most, maybe what I would call democratic. Their way of forging iron, their tradition, requires the least investment. So as long as you have the labor and the source material, you can make iron. And that's associated with the Bantu Expansion. The so-called Bantu Expansion happened in a rapid pace and, just ended by the time the people of, the Dutch, the Afrikaans reached South Africa. That was like the end of the Bantu Expansion. So Africa looked a lot different a millennia ago. But these Bantu people expanded all throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and it's hypothesized that it's to do with their prowess in making iron weapons. And the other cool thing is that it's believed that they developed this independently. Some people speculate that people from Carthage, from the Mediterranean world introduced it, but it looks like their technology, the way they make iron is radically different. Maybe not radically, but quite divergent. And then, other parts of the East Asia, Europe, and maybe India, they had their own iron making technologies. But the Bantus, I think, their style would be very beneficial. So they're from Guinea, what I call Guinea, and their technology would be introduced to the Niger Basin. I demarcate the Niger Basin as part of Libya. I call it Nigeria because it's part of the Islamic world. This Bantu kind of technology is associated, like it first starts in the Atlantic coast area. The Bantus become Bantus when they go out of West Africa. But really, that kind of iron making technology was the lower Niger, Cameroon areas where it kind of started. Anyways, the point is their ironworking technology will be brought over to the Americas via the Islamic Nigerians. The other thing that the Nigerians will bring is disease. It's a way to inoculate because it allows for more resistance. Think about it this way. The conquistador Pizarro is famously said to have benefited from not only a civil war among the Incas, but also because of disease decimating the population. Probably 50% of the population of the Incas that they were controlling died, but like 50 years after that, 100 years after that, the population recovered so much that when the Spanish discovered that literal mountain of silver called Potosi, which accounts for 80% of the world's silver supply, circulation, the world's silver circulation, 80% comes from this one mountain for 3 centuries. When they discover that mountain, they're able to implement a genocidal labor regime where it was so brutal that they would take boys away from their parents that people started maiming their children. They started cutting off their children's hands to prevent them from going to the mines. That's how much population resistance population momentum there was in the high Andes. There's so much population in the high Andes that today Bolivia is still majority indigenous, not mestizo, indigenous. And in Peru, a lot of people say they're mestizo, but it's obvious that Peru and southern Mexico are still areas with high concentrations of indigenous peoples, and it's because they had so much population to begin with. So now disease will hit a bit earlier in my world, and that the 50, 100 years timeline, because the Niger contact, I show that it's not too far away from the Columbia Exchange. So it might be a century, maybe 2 centuries. This map, the time scale is a little off. I apologize for that. It's more artistic. But in my world, the Niger contact with the Guianas, or Venezuela, as I call it, will probably happen 100 to maybe 200 years before the Columbia Exchange. But that's enough time for the population to get hit by disease and spring back, so that by the time Pizarro comes, his little small band of raggedy soldiers won't be able to overtake the Incas. So that's going to be really crucial when we start talking about the Incas later on.
Well, this is really fascinating what you did, especially with the contact between West Africa and
what I call
South
Venezuela.
America. Yeah, Venezuela. Because you're mobilizing essentially a fictional event, which might have happened, right? But it's now tied in myth and lore. And so you're mobilizing that to actually strengthen the diversity of languages and cultures in the so-called Old World by introducing contact before the Columbian Exchange.
Yeah. And I guess the other cool thing is that I'm not interested in creating utopia. Like, I want something that still resembles our kind of history, but I'm just like tweaking it a little bit, just a minor tweak. Some would say it's radical, but it's not. It's really just a tiny drop to give people a better chance, just a little bit better chance. And so that by the time that colonization does happen in this part of the world, I'm not saying colonization is inevitable, but I still think it's useful to think in those terms because there are lessons to be learned there.
Well, it lessens the blow of immediate contact.
Yeah, it lessens the blow of immediate contact, and it also gives them the endurance to wait it out. So, for example, in Mesoamerica, what I call Nicaragua, these people are fully captured by the Spanish, but they're captured in a way where they have a better position to weather out the occupation. So it becomes more like India. Nicaragua, in my world, is supposed to be an analog to India in our world, in the sense that the Mughals, when they capture India, the Indian state, they leave India, by the time of the British Raj, forever altered, but also not radically different. By radically, I just mean that they didn't completely change the linguistic and religious overlay of India. Like, there are still Hindus, there are still people speaking Dravidic and Indo-Aryan languages, right? And in fact, the Mughals, their Urdu language is actually an Indo-Aryanic language. The point here is that when the Spanish reach the Americas in the real world, they're bringing with them not guns and muskets. They're bringing with them arquebuses and crossbows, rapiers, breastplates made out of steel, like primitive helmets. So they're actually almost even match to the obsidian swords, all kinds of apart from the horses, which actually aren't that good in subtropical highlands and also the swamps. Like, what the conquistadors actually had to do was they had to leverage alliances with local indigenous populations. So they were using local indigenous armies to fight local indigenous people. So the point here is that...
Sorry, I was just going to say, in the real world, what really made a difference was the population drop.
Just the population, yeah.
Whereas in this case, since you've introduced disease
a little bit earlier, yeah.
The impact of population loss is much less.
Yeah.
And therefore, combat between these two, the two sides, will likely last longer.
Well,
and be more even matched in the end.
Yeah, and I don't even, maybe I won't even, when I end up writing that plate, I might not even talk about the conquest period as much. Maybe the conquest period is quite similar. Maybe by a stroke of luck, because Hernan Cortez, it was by a stroke of luck that he was able to capture Tenochtitlan or Mexico City. Really, what is important for me is that the population is so much so that the settlement of Mesoamerica or Nicaragua is different. So when they settle it, they have captured a population, but they haven't captured free land. Mm-hmm. So that there's not enough free land to be given to new settlers.
I see.
So that most of so in the south especially, the native population is the majority, and the Spanish just install themselves at the very top. Mm-hmm. And just like, the Mughals installed themselves in the very top, or the Mongols in Iran, the Ilkhanate, or the Mongols in China, they barely impacted. They impacted the language a little bit, but they didn't radically change the shape, the demographic and the cultural shape of China or Iran, right? So same here.
It prevents a population replacement.
Yeah, it prevents population replacement, or even the whole majority mestizo population has been Latinized, prevents that. And so you have actually a Hindu population analog. You have people who are still faithful to the old gods, their old ways. The religion will be shaped a little bit by contact with the Catholics, but it will be Catholics living side by side, these kind of Hindu analogs, what I call the Toltecs. And what's going to happen is that by the time partition happens, by the time decolonization happens, there's going to be the Spanish trying to preserve a mestizo and settler state that's Catholic, and a resurgence of indigenous nationalism in the South. So this kind of partition analog will be a tragedy, but partition doesn't happen in India in my world, so this is where it happens. Yeah, we can talk about it later in the future.
Yeah. Okay, so we just covered those two dotted lines in the Atlantic area, right?
Yeah.
But there's way more of those dotted lines in the Pacific, which kind of actually connect to a whole range of timelines, historically speaking.
Yeah.
So could you kind of tell us more about the dotted lines in the Pacific area?
So what we have here is, we first, let's, from the bottom, it's really quick. The Dalia and Coop one we already covered. That dotted line is the sporadic contact during the Chola expansionary period, and then the solid black line is when they're fully integrated into the Emporic Rim, the Indian Ocean trade networks. So That the other dotted line that connects the Dali Kuk area is very interesting. It connects to the Hokyung branch, right? You can see there's like this long dotted line that runs vertically down. And this is to show you a very interesting theory that is, I wouldn't say it's like fully accepted, but it's a common theory now that the Austronesians didn't really domesticate anything themselves, but were the mediators for domestication events. The Austronesians come from the Yangtze Delta. Very interesting. So the Austronesians are what we call modern day Polynesians, Hawaiians, Maori, Tahitians, and as well as Malagasy in Madagascar. They're also, the main ethno-linguistic groups in almost all of Indonesia and the Philippines. And their homeland is actually started out, like the linguistic homeland people like to start with is Taiwan. Because I think maybe 9 out of 10 branches come from Taiwan. The 10th one is responsible for all those other languages I just listed. So Polynesian, and the Malayic branches, all of those, Malagasy, Maori, Hawaiian, Malay, Bahasa, all the Sulawesi languages, Borneo languages, all of them come from one branch. And then there are like 9 branches with their intricate kind of diversities within themselves in Taiwan.
Wow. So all of this is pre-Hokkien.
Yeah, this is pre-Hokkien. This is like ancient Taiwan. But really, the irony is this. These languages actually first came out of the mainland. So Taiwan isn't the starting point. The Austronesians are hypothesized to have started in the Yangtze Delta and maybe just south of it. And that there's a substratum of Austronesian words in Hokkien today that hint at an Austronesian population existing in Fujian province is, in Hokkien people. And so the irony is that the Hokkien the Chinese drove out the Austronesians when they migrated south to Taiwan. And then, a millennia later, or maybe 2 millennia later, they then go to Taiwan and further, drive them further to the east, right? That's the funny irony, or not funny, but it's just interesting how history works in that way. Anyway, so the point here is that the Austronesians, when they came out of the Yangtze Delta, knew how to grow, rice or equivalent kind of grains. They were already sedentary and farming. So the people in Taiwan today, actually, for thousands of years or hundreds of years, have been growing various species of millet, and they've been growing taro. But it's believed that they brought those crops with them from the Yangtze Delta, from the Kiang. And it's also believed that when they started doing their canoeing south to Sulawesi, that would be the area where they contacted the Papuans, the Cook, because actually there's a substratum of genetics and linguistics to suggest that the people in eastern Indonesia, at least, are Papuan, have Papuan heritage, and then that western Indonesia and the Malay archipelago have something called the Negrito influence. Negrito is, it's still used in literature, so I'm going to use it here, but really it's a reference to these I guess the most obvious thing for Europeans would be dark skin. So these are dark skinned people, people resembling the people in the Andaman Islands. Nicobar and Andaman Islands they capture the imagination of modern day people because they're still uncontacted or isolated tribes. But it was hypothesized that all of Indonesia had this group of people, and there's still relic populations in the Philippines and in parts of Indonesia, and historically Chinese people recorded contact with these peoples in Taiwan. So that's really cool. They are talking about Negrito people in all of these island groups, right? And so there's Papuans who are also related, but from a different migration point in human history. So in these two areas, and the Austronesians, when they're going down, they meet these people probably around Sulawesi, the H-shaped island. And this is where they, bring sugarcane, taro, wing bean, and all candle nut. But all of this starts mixing. And so the modern day Indonesian crop package is a marriage of those two. Taiwan is probably an area where there's the least influence from the Papuan area, and the Maori are probably the least influence from the Taiwan or Yangtze River area. For example, Taiwanese Aboriginals or indigenous peoples of Taiwan, except for the very south, like the southern tip of Taiwan, do not use coconut. But coconut features almost is the dominant staple in almost all the foodways of Austronesia, from the Malagasy to Hawaii. Interestingly, when these peoples, the Austronesians, branched out and became Polynesians, and when they eventually went to Hawaii, they had lost rice cultivation, but they remembered the wetland cultivation. So they're using taro in wetland cultivation instead of rice. So they just adapted. And the coolest thing is that by the time they go from Tahiti to Aotearoa or New Zealand, by the time they get there, only the northern tip is like warm enough for their crop package. So by the time they get to New Zealand, it's a little too cold, and so they kind of maybe 20th century European scholars would say regress, but it's not regression at all. They further adapt their ways, and they go back to mostly hunting gathering. So they don't really farm that much anymore. But in my world, one of the dotted lines suggests a Pacific contact, trans-Pacific contact between South America and Polynesia. Anyways, that's going to lead to potatoes and oca. Oca is commonly eaten in New Zealand today. That's funny or irony. Oca is an Andean crop related to potato. But in my world, it's going to feature prominently in the indigenous foods in Maori culture, so that they're going to have a bigger population base when Europeans contact them. Anyway, so that's what those two dotted lines mean, meeting between the Hokiang and the Dali Kuk. But you can see that dotted line, like, I was a little ambivalent. I didn't want to make the Austronesians their own kind of river source. So they are like a meeting point of those dotted lines. But then that meeting point has branching off for contact with other, river branches. So let's talk about the one that goes to the Afro-Eurasian River. That one is Madagascar. It might be a little flawed to just devote a whole line to the Madagascar event, but it's really cool because Madagascar is all the way on the other side of the Indian Ocean, and this is not a fringe theory. It's 100% accepted. Their closest relatives are in Borneo, not like West Coast Sumatra, but Borneo. They went from Borneo to Madagascar, and at that point, I believe their language already had some Buddhist words, some Sanskrit words. So it's quite late when they contacted when they got to Madagascar, which was supposedly not populated, but really quickly soon afterwards, Bantu people started going to the other side of the coast. But it's hypothesized that maybe only 20 women, like Malagasy people are descended from only 20 women, and that they brought all their crops with them, including rice, to Madagascar and did wetland cultivations in the highlands. So the Malagasy are introducing this kind of East Asian crop to sub-Saharan Africa, independent of the whole river branch story. So that's the dotted lines for that area. The other two dotted lines here,
so they go across back to the left side.
Yeah, so they're crossing the Pacific, and this is a map kind of. So they're crossing the other side of the Pacific on the left side of the map. And the confusing thing here is that the lines crisscross because of a temporal technicality. So the top line here, the one that branches off of the Hokiang dotted line, that is a Saracen contact with the Pacific Northwest, which happens later downstream than the Pacific Polynesian contact. So we'll talk about the Pacific Polynesian one because we already talked about it before. So this one is really interesting because it really happened. Okay, we don't have as much evidence as the Norse. Actually, no, it depends. The Norse one, we have an archaeological dig site. The Pacific Polynesian one, we have linguistic evidence, which is that the word for sweet potato, kumara, in Quechua, this word is cognate to sweet potato in all of the South Pacific languages. Okay? Whereas like the Philippines, the Austronesians in the Philippines, their sweet potato is related to nahuatl, kamote, which comes from the Manila galleon trade between Acapulco and Manila, which is actually one of the most epic sea voyages you could do. Okay, like the Spanish were that greedy or that driven by profit that they did that amazing feat every year between Manila and Acapulco with like galleons. So very primitive sailing technology. That's besides the point. Kumara, though, is evidence that sweet potato made it to the South Pacific before Europeans brought it. And also, there's evidence that chickens, which are native to Southeast Asia, there's DNA evidence of chicken bones, but also it's been recorded that chickens arrived, like Europeans were talking about chickens in South America, in Chile and Peru, before they introduced it there. So those are two evidences, but those are less conclusive than real physical, archaeological dig sites like the Norse. So it's not as well accepted. Anyway, so this contact is going to be very interesting for me because it's going to allow for some room to maneuver in colonization in Peru, because it allows for I guess the Polynesians, they also got decimated by disease because they were semi-isolated. But in my world, I'm going to use them as kind of mediators between Southeast Asia and South America. There's going to be interesting stuff there. You're going to have to stay tuned for that. The Saracen one, or the East Asian one that I'm talking about down here, downstream, is contact between the Ainu and the Pacific Northwest. And the Ainu are interesting for me because, first of all, they're a language isolate, and they are semi-sedentary. So they are peoples who farm at least two species of millet, and at the same time, they also prefer to hunt and gather and to fish salmon. And their material culture resembles that of the Pacific Northwest, superficially at least. Maybe the people in the Pacific Northwest don't do as much tattooing, but the abstract kind of form and design of the Ainu clothing is very similar to the clothing and the blankets and the kind of longhouse art designs in the Pacific Northwest. And also, they also made clothes out of bark, just like the cedar bark clothes of the Pacific Northwest. They also venerated, bears and salmons. And the fact that they're a language isolate allows for, a separate storyline for me. So that it's not just like, oh, they all become Chinese, they all become Japanese. So the Ainu aren't like as hegemonic. Obviously, they're a population that's quite similar to the Pacific Northwest. So when they are reaching the Pacific Northwest, their contact won't be as drastic, but it'll be strategically important for the same reasons as the Niger Venezuelan one. So disease and iron weapons. But it's interesting to say that their culture is already quite similar, so that it actually just allows for equilibrium, like an osmosis thing, where both sides kind of become similar. So, for example, modern day Pacific Northwest people, indigenous peoples, love eating soy sauce with a native food ingredient called ooligan grease. Ooligan grease is made out of candlefish, which is a fish that's so fat that you can burn it like a candle, and it creates something equivalent to butter in that area of the world. That mix of soy sauce is like the main condiment for dressing all foods for like hundreds of years now, for at least 200 years for the people in the Pacific Northwest. And that soy sauce obviously comes from the Japanese and Chinese migrants and settlers in the early histories of British Columbia and Oregon and Washington. But the point here is that the Ainu will be trading for this ooligan grease because they'll like it as well. And they're going to be introducing soy sauce. And they're also going to be introducing ironworking technology that actually the Tlingit and the Haida already know about. They knew how to work it. They didn't know how to make it, but they knew how to work it because for hundreds and thousands of years, Japanese Japanese ships have been washing ashore in the Pacific Northwest, such as the ocean gyres and currents that, today if we go to the beach, we can find Russian garbage and Chinese garbage there, right? And the Russian one for sure comes from Vladivostok and the Far East in Russia. There's also records of Japanese sailors being washed ashore and captured as slaves. And there's one history in the European arrival period. There's one history where there's a Japanese fisherman who pleads for help from an American schooner and is taken back because he had spent some years in captivity by some of these peoples in the Pacific Northwest. So it's not too hard to believe that this has been happening for centuries. But finally, the Ainu allow for two-way contact. Oh, and the point about the iron thing is that iron weapons and iron, like nails would arrive on their shores, and the people there would work it into daggers. And they also knew how to work copper into daggers. So they actually had a dagger-carrying kind of culture that was very similar to the Ainu sword-carrying culture, which would eventually become quite similar to the samurai katana-wielding culture. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so those are the contact points.
Right. And I guess there's one last one here, which is the black line connecting the Polynesian to the mainstream, which is the last contact point.
Right, so...
or point of convergence.
Right. I just wanted to do that because even though Polynesia isn't its own source, at some point they started domesticating their own crops. Like, they had sago and cycad in the Micronesia, sago, cycad. But then at some point, breadfruit and other kinds of really interesting starches that become staples. And, they bring bananas over to the Pacific. Anyways, the point is, there are some domesticates that are unique to the Polynesia, okay? And so they become their own source. And this black line is showing European contact with Polynesia, the South Pacific. And it's really interesting because the history that most people like to remember about that is the mutiny on the Bounty. But people forget that the backdrop of that story is that it was Europeans trying to bring breadfruit from the South Pacific to the Caribbean for their slave plantation system. So they wanted an easier starch than plantain. They wanted a starch that was easier to grow and control and predictable. And they found that breadfruit was this magical crop that, had high yields. And they wanted to bring those specimens from the South Pacific, from Tahiti, all the way to the Caribbean. And that was the setup for the mutiny in the middle of the Pacific.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so up to this point of convergence, it was more or less historical. Meaning historical plus, a little bit of fiction to increase contact between regions.
Yeah.
And from there on, it kind of foreshadows this idea of, a globalized, unique culture. But that's not actually what you mean.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have this kind of delta,
right,
which branches out.
Yeah. So good catch there. So the point, the previous episodes we talked about Vidal de la Blache, Frederick Rotzel, and their whole idea that the world is bound to become all uniform. That it was a fate for humanity to become the same through globalization. I'm fascinated by contact points. I'm fascinated by cross-cultural exchanges, but I believe that it's a human belief, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, to say that contact will lead to flattening of culture between the two of us, that will kind of level out and become the same. My example is this. For hundreds of years now, after the Columbian Exchange, Indians, Koreans, and Thai people have been using the same introduced ingredients to different effects, right? There's no guarantee that that contact, steady contact even, will lead to people all trying to be the same, to get the same end result. People can take the same ingredients, put it through an input it through their culture box, and come out with a different product. And so the point here is that with the delta, a delta usually is so flat that rivers, when the river goes into that delta system, apart from maybe the Congo River, which is very unique, the Congo River has no delta. It's fascinating. No delta because the water force. Anyway, okay. Most rivers will have huge deltas. It flattens out, and the river will skip, right? The river will branch off, and these branches will actually skip into each other, and they will converge and converge and diverge before they all hit the ocean. Now, the metaphor doesn't really work after you hit the ocean, so we're not going to talk about that because, the ocean, people say that's the water cycle. It all becomes one and it gets recycled, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to stay with the delta part. The delta point is that you can have parallel cultures. You can have people appropriating from each other, but existing in parallel with each other. So you can have Mesoamerican peoples in modern day eating chocolate with cinnamon, and you can have people eating chocolate with vanilla in other parts of the world. You can have people using peppers in different ways. Mm-hmm. Tomato is the ultimate umami ingredient for almost all peoples around the world now. Chinese people have figured out how to use tomatoes, and it's very interesting because they don't even I believe that tomato is underutilized in Chinese cuisine. It's only used mostly with the scrambled egg dish, and sometimes with beef noodle soup. But there's no tomato gravy that happens in Indian cuisine and Italian cuisine, right? People can use crops for different ways. The people who eat barley in Tibet eat barley in a very different way than the Germans eat barley, right? Oat noodles are a thing in northern China, okay? They literally roll oat flour into noodles and steam it. They steam oats, okay? Compare that to oatmeal and haggis in Scotland. Very different. So there's that, and also the sharing of ideas and cultural exchange apart from food, right? Livestock exchange, so llamas on camels, horses. Horses are a big thing in the plains. Camels are from Arabia, but are now the dromedary camel is ubiquitous in sub-Saharan Africa, or at least in the Sahara and Sahel. But they can take shape and manifest in different ways. So The point here is that even religion, when religion is introduced, it can become its own thing, right? I have this work called Epidoxy that I'm going to introduce in my fact book series. But epidoxy, epi on the surface, and dox is like, theology, right? So for me, epidoxy is a good way of explaining non-Abrahamic religions and the way they interact with each other. In Taiwan, you have, in one temple, you can have a Shinto equivalent, so Shendao culture. You can have Taoism, you can have Buddhism, and you can have the Mazu cult. The Mazu cult is this like seafaring religious practice that is actually common, that there's common threads in both sides of Taiwan Strait and all of Okinawa. There are references to this like sea goddess in Kyushu, Okinawa, Taiwan, Hokkien. But all of this is found in one temple. You can go to a Buddhist temple and do sacrilegious non-Buddhist things, burn paper money like a Taoist, and and pray for your fisherman husband in Mazu. All of this is in one temple, so that's what I use for epidoxy. But what I'm saying is like Buddhism from India goes to East Asia, has a different shape. So like people fetishize different aspects of a thing that comes to them, or they take focus of a different aspect, and they make it their own. It doesn't, like this kind of modern idea of globalization of everyone having to act the same way, eat the same food, shake hands the same way, wear the same suits, do the 9-to-5 kind of work thing, and all that kind of stuff is prescribed. Not a natural progress, it's prescribed. And it's prescribed maybe unintentionally by most people. And a lot of parents will say, I'm going to let my child learn English because it has currency in the modern world. But that's prescribed. Like what we call cultural capital, university degree, Western educated, that is prescribed ultimately. And people say, well, just because it's a social norm and a structural problem doesn't mean that it's easy to change. I know that. I know it's hard to change these like normative structures, but I just want people to have a way out, either by fantasizing and dreaming by looking at this, or actually using this to inspire themselves to do like micro steps in the right direction or change the way they view the world.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that was beautifully said. And now this diagram map makes a lot more sense to me.
Thank you.
And I mean, I really like how you leveraged the metaphors of water, of hydrology, to represent these ideas, but they also are analogous to areas, so geographic areas of crop domestication, but are also used to represent convergence
of culture,
and ultimately a way of cross-cultural pollination, where technology from one culture can actually be integrated, and like you so beautifully explained it. Maybe we can mention another important river in the world, which is the Congo River.
Yeah, Zaire.
Why isn't it in your map here, in your diagram?
Yeah, so the the Nile and the Indus, people would expect to be in it, but like I already explained, they're part of the Mesopotamian one. I couldn't find the evidence I wanted to include it, but for me, the Congo River is cooler to mention, to bring up, because Zaire was also another name for the Congo River. The Congo River is named after a people and a kingdom, actually. The Zaire River is actually the proper name for some peoples in that part of the world. Zaire means that which consumes everything. So the river that kind of accepts all the tributaries and becomes one, right? So this would lend itself better to Frederick Rousseau and Vidal de la Blache, right? Like it lends itself more to the Western idea of globalization because it consumes everything and becomes all the same. Okay, but here we have the extra bit about the delta, where the river analogy is imperfect because there's no showing what's happening when they're all in one stream together. Like at the delta, you show that everything's like parallel and they're co-developing. But really, that process is happening the entire time. Each time a confluence happens, it should be all these like micro rivers running together, hitting each other, then running together and hitting each other. And in real nature, there's only one example of that, of two rivers that kind of converge before they hit the ocean. You know where that is?
South Africa?
No, in the Amazon. The Rio Negro and the Amazon River, seasonally when there's the flooding season, will have a river branch that connects the two of them. Like, there's not a lot of recorded evidence of that happening in the real world. My point is, most of history is like that. There's rivers running parallel, hitting each other, and running parallel, and diverging, then converging, and then they all hit this delta where they all spread. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
Nice.